The third and best way to add CSS to our HTML file is to use an external CSS. That is, it's going to be external to our HTML file. It's not a part of it. It's a separate file. To add external CSS, we would have to create this external CSS and then link it to our HTML file. To link it, we use a link element that we place in the head section, just like this example here. The link element will have 3 different attributes applied to it. The first one is href, which tells the web browser where to find this external file. The second one is the type, just to tell the web browser that this is a CSS type of file. And then the last attribute is the relationship, or REL attribute. And we're saying that the relationship between this HTML file and the external file is that it's a style sheet. To get started, let's go to our folder where you have your HTML file and create a new folder inside that. Call this new folder CSS. Then go to your text editor and create a new file. File new. I'm using Dreamweaver, so when I start a new CSS file, it automatically adds code to it. I'll just delete that. And we're not going to put anything in this one yet. We'll save that for the next video. But for now, save this into that new folder that you created. There it is. And call this file style, S-T-Y-L-E, .css. Make sure that instead of saving it as a .txt, depending on what kind of text editor you're using, or instead of using it or saving it as a .html file, save this one as a .css. So right now, what you should have in your Lab 2 folder is the HTML file that we've been working with. And in the same folder as this HTML file, you should have a CSS folder. And then inside that CSS folder is this style.css file. For this to work, as I'm going to code it, this is how your files should be set up. Now that I've created this external CSS file, there has to be a way for us to connect that. And that's where this link element comes in. There's no way for this HTML file to know that it should be using that style sheet until we tell it to. Let's put this link element right after the title tag in the head section. So there's link, href. We're going to tell the web browser where to find this external file. Now the way this works is we're going to use a relative link. And as you will recall, relative links will look for files relative to where this HTML file is. Where this HTML file is, there is a CSS folder. So we'll start with that, CSS. So we're saying that in the same folder where this HTML file is, go to that CSS folder. And then inside that CSS folder is style.css. Next attribute is type, text CSS. And finally, relationship, REL, equals style sheet. So, this link element is another one of those examples of tags that do not have an opening or closing tag. So for this one, we will do that / and greater than sign to close it off. With this link element, if you coded it correctly, it will now be connected to the style.css. And now all we have to do is put in all the different CSS rules instead of embedding it or putting it in line like we did in the last two examples. Now, why do we want to use external style sheets? Well, the biggest advantage is several web pages can share the same style sheet. This means that if you have 100 pages, 5 pages, or 12,000 pages, like UCM's website, all you need to worry about is one file. And then with just one change within this style sheet, you can make numerous changes across your website. For example, if I would have put this H1 rule in style.css, if I make any kind of changes to that, any H1s throughout my website will be changed. I don't have to go page by page. This makes it a lot easier to edit. There's also the benefit of a faster load time, because when the web browser looks through your HTML, it doesn't have to read all this embedded style sheet or the inline style sheet. All it will have is the content. And this is what I mean by separating content from presentation. We will have just our content in the HTML and then our presentation information in the style sheet. Now for this lab 2, that's not the case because I use this to illustrate the concept of adding an embedded or internal style sheet and then also an inline style sheet. But in future assignments, especially your website project, what I would like to see is that you separate the two, separate presentation from content. Now, before we actually get to adding and using adding CSS rules using our external style sheet, let's talk about CSS stuff. Yeah, I know, that's really technical, right? But what can you do? Okay, the first stuff I want to talk about is a CSS rule. A CSS rule is CSS formatting instruction, and we already did an example of a CSS rule in that embedded style sheet. This whole highlighted thing from the H1 all the way to the closing curly bracket, that's what you call a rule. It consists of a selector, that would be the H1 in this example. The selector indicates which element the rule applies to. In the example that we did, this CSS rule applies to all H1 elements within this particular page because it's an embedded style sheet. Then we have the declaration part. Font size 64px, that's an example of a declaration. Color red, that's another declaration. So this indicates how the element referred to in the selector, the H1, how it should be styled. And you can have more than one declaration. And if you notice, we are separating each declaration with a semicolon. Just like HTML, all this white space is just for our benefit. Your web browser doesn't need all this extra white space. We can make our CSS look like this if we want to. But for me, I like to keep each declaration in its own line because if you look at a typical CSS style sheet, it will have hundreds of lines of code. And if you were to try to edit that, it would be kind of difficult when you don't have a lot of white space. All right, so we're back to how I like to see it. The declaration has two parts to it. This is the property, which is the aspect of the element you want to change. For the H1, we're trying to change the font size. We're trying to change the color, the font family, and font weight. And then the value is the specific setting that we want to use for the chosen property. So for font size, we want it to be set at 64 pixels. For the color property, we want it to be red. For font family, sans serif, and then font weight, normal. Those are the different components of a CSS, and you will want to familiarize yourself well enough with the vocabulary so that when I'm throwing out these terms in future videos, you're going to have an idea of what I'm talking about. In the next video then, we will start adding code to our external style sheet